The sun was a merciless hammer over the dusty plains of Texas, beating down on the weathered planks of Jedediah Cobb's cattle ranch. At 16, Ethan felt every one of its blows. He wasn't a man, not yet, but his hands were calloused like a seasoned rancher's, and his shoulders ached from the weight of a life that offered little more than hardship. Ethan was an orphan, his parents swallowed by a typhoid fever 3 years prior, leaving him in the care of Jedediah, a man whose heart was as dry as the land he farmed. Jedediah saw Ethan not as a boy, but as a cheap hand, a body to be pushed until it broke. Ethan's daily routine was a brutal, monotonous cycle. He woke before the first light, his stomach a hollow echo, and worked until the last sliver of sun vanished behind the distant horizon. He mended fences, shoveled manure and branded cattle, all while enduring Jedediah's constant stream of insults. "Lazy boy," Jedediah would sneer, his spit hitting the dry ground. "Your parents gave you nothing but a name and a lot of trouble." But today was different. The air was thick with a nervous energy, a buzz that had nothing to do with the flies. A local ranch hand, old and grizzled, rode into the yard, his horse lathered in sweat. He dismounted slowly, his eyes wide. "Jedediah!" the man gasped, his voice raspy. "Jedediah, you won't believe it. Black Lightning, he was seen near the old canyon. He's back." The name sent a ripple through the small group of ranch hands gathered around. Black Lightning wasn't just a horse, he was a legend. A wild Mustang, pure black with a white blaze on his forehead, said to be faster than the wind and smarter than any man who'd ever tried to catch him. Stories of his untamable spirit were whispered around campfires, tales of men who had tried and failed, some even losing their lives in the attempt. Jedediah scoffed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a familiar greed. "Just another wild horse," he grumbled, though his gaze shifted to his best horse, a powerful roan. Ethan, listening from the shadows of the barn, felt a different kind of stir. For him, Black Lightning wasn't a prize to be won or a beast to be broken. He was a symbol of freedom, of untamed power in a world that sought to control everything. The Mustang was a mirror of his own yearning to escape the suffocating life he was trapped in. Later that afternoon, Ethan was tasked with hauling water from the well when he heard the rumble of hooves. It was Sheriff Thorne, a man whose presence was as welcome as a rattlesnake. Thorne was a large man, his belly straining against his uniform, his face perpetually set in a sneer. He was a bully with a badge, a man who found joy in the misery of others. He'd tormented Ethan ever since the boy had arrived on the ranch, and his cruel jokes were a daily torment. Thorne dismounted with a huff, his spurs clinking on the hard ground. His eyes, cold and calculating, fell on Ethan. Well, if it isn't the Orphan," he drawled, his voice a low mockery. "Heard you boys are all excited about that wild stallion. Don't go getting any ideas, boy. That kind of horse is for real men, not for a scrawny runt like you." Ethan kept his head down, but his jaw tightened. He didn't respond. A strategy he'd learned was the only way to survive Thorne's taunts. The sheriff, however, wasn't finished. He kicked a loose stone with his boot, his gaze fixed on Ethan's face. "You think you could ever ride a horse like that? You'll never ride a Mustang, boy. You're nothing but dust and dirt, just like this land." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, then turned and sauntered into the ranch house to talk business with Jedediah. The words hung in the air, a venomous echo. "You'll never ride a Mustang." Something inside Ethan snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, firm resolve. He was tired of the scorn, the humiliation, the constant reminder of his insignificance. He looked out at the vast open plains, a sea of brown and gold under the setting sun. Out there somewhere was Black Lightning, and in that moment the dream of freedom became a purpose. Ethan decided he would find that horse. He would care for him, tame him not through force but with trust, and in doing so he would prove not only to the sheriff but to himself that he was more than just an orphan boy. He would ride the Mustang, and he would finally find his place in the world. The next morning, before the sun had even painted the sky with its first strokes of orange and pink, Ethan was ready. He packed a meager bag with jerky, a canteen of water, and a worn leather rope he'd been saving for just such an occasion. He chose one of the older, slower horses from the paddock, a gentle mare named Sadie, who wouldn't draw Jedediah's attention. He whispered a silent promise to her, a promise he intended to keep. They would be back. His plan was simple, if not naive. He would follow the rumors, the whispers of Black Lightning's last sighting near the old canyon. He knew the land, the dusty trails and the hidden arroyos, better than anyone on the ranch. It was a knowledge born from years of solitary work, of moving cattle across miles of unforgiving terrain. He rode out as silently as a ghost, leaving the ranch behind as a dark, oppressive memory. The air was cool and crisp, but as the sun rose, the heat returned with a vengeance. The landscape stretched out before him, a tapestry of brown and beige, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional resilient mesquite tree. The silence of the plains was broken only by the rhythmic thud of Sadie's hooves and the sigh of the wind. For 2 days, Ethan rode, his eyes scanning the horizon, his ears listening for any sign of the wild stallion. He saw deer, coyotes, and circling vultures, but no sign of a horse, let alone the legendary black one. His water was running low and his jerky was almost gone. Doubt began to creep in. A cold, unwelcome visitor. Was he foolish? Was Thorne right? Was this just another one of his childish dreams destined to crumble into dust? On the 3rd day, as despair began to set in, he saw them. Tracks. Fresh ones. Large, clear hoofprints pressed into the soft earth near a dried-up creek bed. These weren't the tracks of a regular horse. They were larger, more defined, and they headed towards the treacherous, rocky terrain of the Red Rock Canyon. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He knew the canyon was a dangerous place. Flash floods could turn a dry gully into a raging river in minutes, and the jagged rocks could cripple a horse. But the tracks were clear. Black lightning was out there, possibly in need of water. As he rode closer, the landscape changed dramatically. The flat plains gave way to towering red rock formations, their faces carved by centuries of wind and water. The air grew cooler, trapped in the narrow crevices. He dismounted, leading Sadie by the reins, and began to navigate the labyrinthine paths. He was so focused on the ground that he didn't see the figure until he was almost upon her. She was a girl, maybe a year or 2 younger than him, kneeling beside a small, bubbling spring. Her hair was a riot of fiery red curls, and her face was smudged with dirt. She was tending to a small injured rabbit, gently splinting its tiny leg with 2 sticks and a piece of cloth. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide, and a brilliant shade of green. For a moment neither of them spoke. Ethan, unaccustomed to seeing anyone out in this remote part of the world, felt a blush creep up his neck. "You're a long way from home," she said, her voice soft but direct. "Lost?" "No," Ethan replied quickly, feeling a strange need to assert himself. "I'm looking for a horse, a Mustang." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Black lightning." Ethan's eyes widened. "You've seen him?" "He drinks from this spring sometimes," she said, gesturing to the water. "My name's Sarah. I'm with a small group of settlers camped a few miles from here. We've been looking for a place to build a new life." Ethan introduced himself, and a wave of relief washed over him. He wasn't alone. This girl, with her kind eyes and gentle hands, felt like an ally in a world that had offered him only adversaries. He told her about his quest, about the sheriff's taunts, and about his desperate need to find the horse. Sarah listened patiently, her expression one of deep understanding. "He's a beautiful creature," she said when he was finished, "but he's been acting strange lately. He's been limping. I think he's hurt." Ethan's heart sank. A wounded animal, especially a wild one, was a vulnerable animal. The fact that the sheriff was hunting him now took on a new, darker meaning. He wasn't just after a legendary horse. He was after an injured one, a prize to be taken easily. "We have to find him," Ethan said, a new sense of urgency in his voice. "Before they do." Sarah nodded. "I can help. I know this canyon like the back of my hand. My father taught me to track. We'll find him together." And so the boy who had always been alone found an unexpected partner in his quest, a girl with fiery hair and a gentle spirit. Together, they would face the vast, unforgiving landscape, not just for a legendary horse, but for a shared dream of compassion and freedom. With Sarah's help, the search for Black Lightning became more focused, less a desperate wander and more a calculated pursuit. Sarah's tracking skills were incredible. She could read the land like a book, pointing out broken twigs, scuff marks on the rock, and subtle changes in the ground that Ethan would have missed. "He's been running hard," she observed, her finger tracing a faint line in the dust. "See how the hoofprint is deeper on one side? He's favoring his left front leg." Ethan's heart ached with each step. To him, Black Lightning was more than a wild horse. He was a king, a symbol of untamed power. The thought of him injured and vulnerable stirred a fierce protectiveness in the boy. They spent another day tracking, their progress slowed by the treacherous terrain. The canyon walls rose around them, their red faces glowing in the late afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. They spoke little, a comfortable silence settling between them as they worked. Sarah pointed out different plants, explaining their uses, and Ethan shared stories of the ranch, painting a picture of a life he longed to leave behind. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long purple shadows, they finally found him. Black lightning lay in a narrow crevice, sheltered by a large rock overhang. He was magnificent, even in his pain. His coat was a deep, lustrous black, and his muscles rippled under his skin, a testament to his power. But his breathing was labored, and his left front leg was swollen to twice its normal size, a deep gash visible just above the hoof. The horse lifted his head, his dark eyes filled with a primal mix of fear and defiance. He whinnied, a sound of both pain and warning. He tried to stand, but a sharp wince of pain forced him back down. Ethan's first instinct was to rush to him, but Sarah placed a firm hand on his arm. "Slowly," she whispered. "He's terrified. He doesn't know us. Go too fast, and he'll panic." They approached cautiously, their movements deliberate and non-threatening. Ethan pulled out some dried oats from his bag and held out his hand. The horse watched him, his ears flicking nervously. For what felt like an eternity, the Mustang's gaze darted between Ethan and Sarah, his beautiful wild eyes searching for a hint of malice. Finally, with a soft snort, he lowered his head and took a tentative sniff of the oats. Ethan held his breath, his hand steady. The horse took a few grains, then a few more, his powerful jaw chewing slowly. A strange calm settled over the crevice. For the rest of the evening they worked. Ethan carefully cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and some clean cloths Sarah had in her bag. The horse flinched but didn't fight, a silent acknowledgement of their help. Sarah, with a skill that surprised Ethan, used a paste made from a local herb to help with the swelling and prevent infection. She told him her mother was a healer, and she had learned much from her. As night fell, they built a small smokeless fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. They shared the last of Ethan's jerky and some dried berries Sarah had gathered. They talked for hours, their voices low, their words painting a world they both hoped to one day live in, a world of their own making, free from the judgments of others. "He's a good boy," Sarah said softly, watching the Mustang rest. "He just needs someone to trust." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the sleeping horse. He thought about the sheriff's cruel words, about the mockery that had fueled his journey. He thought about Jedediah's constant complaints. But out here, with the stars glittering like diamonds in the inky black sky and the gentle breathing of the injured horse, all of that seemed to fade. All that mattered was the horse, the girl, and the silent promise of a different future. They took turns keeping watch, an unspoken agreement to protect the majestic creature they had found. Ethan sat with his back against the cool rock, the Mustang a few feet away, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about saving a life, about caring for a beautiful animal that was a prisoner of his own pain. The journey had just begun, and the real challenge lay ahead, getting Black Lightning back to health and away from the clutches of the men who would exploit his power. The next morning brought with it a renewed sense of urgency. The Mustang's leg was still swollen, but the paste had done its work, and the pain seemed to have lessened. He was able to put a little weight on it, a small victory that gave Ethan and Sarah hope. But they couldn't stay in the canyon forever. They were low on supplies, and the longer they stayed, the more likely they were to be found. "We need to move him," Ethan said, looking at the difficult terrain ahead. "He won't be able to run. We'll have to lead him slowly." The task was a monumental one. Leading a wild Mustang, especially an injured one, was almost impossible. Black Lightning was still wary, his head held high, his ears constantly swiveling. He followed them, but it was a reluctant, distrustful follow. Any sudden noise or movement would make him tense, ready to bolt. Their progress was painfully slow. They moved at a snail's pace, navigating the winding paths of the canyon, all while keeping a watchful eye on the horizon. They knew that Jedediah and Thorne would be looking for the Mustang, and they weren't the only ones. The legend of Black Lightning had spread far and wide, and others would be searching for him as well. During a rest stop by a small stream, Sarah explained more about her family's camp. "We're a group of people who want to start a new town," she said, her voice full of a quiet hope. "We believe in community, in helping each other. My father says the West is big enough for everyone to build their own life, not just for the powerful." Ethan listened, fascinated. The idea of a place built on kindness and cooperation was alien to him. His world was one of greed and selfishness, of Jedediahs and Thornes. He saw a glimmer of a different future in her words, a future he desperately wanted to be a part of. Their conversation was cut short by a sound that sent a jolt of panic through them both, the distant rumble of hooves. "Riders," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "We have to hide." They quickly found a narrow overhang, a cave-like formation in the rock face, and led Black Lightning inside. The space was just big enough for the three of them and Sadie. Ethan pressed himself against the cold rock, his hand on the Mustang's neck, trying to calm the animal. Black Lightning was agitated, his nostrils flaring, his body tense. The riders passed by, their voices echoing in the canyon. It was a group of men Ethan didn't recognize, their clothes dusty, their faces hard. They were talking about a bounty on the wild Mustang, a bounty so large it would set them up for life. They rode on, their voices fading into the distance, but the fear lingered. Once the coast was clear, they emerged, the tension thick in the air. The bounty hunters were a new, unexpected threat, and it became clear that they weren't just running from Jedediah and Thorne. They were running from everyone who saw Black Lightning as a prize to be sold. "We need to get him to my camp," Sarah said, her voice firm. "My father will know what to do. He's a good man, Ethan. He'll help us." The journey resumed, more urgent now. They traveled through the night, guided by the light of a half-moon. The Mustang, sensing their fear and their need to move, seemed to cooperate more. He stumbled a few times, but each time Ethan was there to steady him, his hand a calming presence on the horse's muscular neck. He spoke to the horse in a low, soothing voice, telling him about the stars, about the freedom they were fighting for, about the peace he hoped they would find. As dawn broke, a sense of exhaustion and triumph washed over them. They had made it. In the distance, Ethan could see the faint outline of a small settlement. Tents and covered wagons were scattered around a central fire, and people were already moving about, starting their day. Sarah smiled, a beautiful, genuine smile that lit up her dirt-smudged face. "We're home," she said. Ethan looked at the girl beside him, at the proud wild horse standing a few feet away, and at the small, hopeful community on the horizon. He had come to the West alone, a boy with nothing but a dream and a heart full of defiance. Now he had a purpose, a friend, and a newfound sense of belonging. The true test lay ahead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The small settlement was a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving land around it. It wasn't a town yet, but a collection of tents and wagons, each a testament to the hard work and hope of the people who lived there. As Ethan and Sarah approached, several people stopped what they were doing and came to greet them. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind face and a thick, graying beard stepped forward. "Sarah, we were starting to worry about you. Where have you been?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Father, we found him," she said, her eyes shining. "This is Ethan. He found Black Lightning." Her father's eyes widened as he looked at the magnificent but visibly injured Mustang. He didn't question them or doubt their story. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze thoughtful and steady. "Come," he said, motioning for them to follow. "We'll get him looked at." They led Black Lightning to a clear space, and a few men, their faces etched with the lines of hard work, gathered around. They were not bounty hunters or opportunists. They were men who understood horses, who saw not a prize but a living creature in pain. Sarah's father, whose name was Thomas, knelt beside the horse, his large, gentle hands examining the swollen leg. He spoke in a low, soothing voice, and surprisingly, the Mustang seemed to calm down under his touch. "It's a bad cut," Thomas said, "but it's not broken. We'll need to keep it clean and keep him still. He'll need rest and food." A woman, Sarah's mother, came out of a nearby tent, a gentle smile on her face. She carried a pouch of herbs and a clean cloth. "Let's get him comfortable," she said, her voice as soft as a whisper. For the first time since he had set out on his journey, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He was among people who cared, who saw the value in an animal's life. He told them his story, leaving out no detail. The loneliness, the sheriff's taunts, the desperation that had driven him to seek out Black Lightning. The men listened with quiet respect. They didn't mock him for being an orphan or for his seemingly foolish quest. They understood the connection between a boy and an animal, the deep, unspoken bond that could form in a world that offered so little solace. Thomas placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Son, you did a good thing," he said, his eyes filled with genuine admiration. "That horse is a symbol of freedom. You weren't just looking for him, you were looking for something to believe in." Ethan's eyes welled up. He quickly looked away, unused to such kindness. He was used to being told he was worthless, that his dreams were empty. This validation was a new and overwhelming experience. They settled Black Lightning in a temporary enclosure they made from some spare wood, a sheltered space where he could rest and recuperate. The community rallied around him. A young boy brought him a bucket of fresh water, a woman brought a bundle of hay, and a couple of men began to craft a more permanent shelter for him. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, a bowl of warm stew in his hands, and watched the community in action. People were laughing, talking, and working together. Children played games, their laughter echoing in the cool evening air. It was a world away from the silent, oppressive loneliness of Jedediah's ranch. Sarah sat beside him, her gaze thoughtful. "My father believes that if you build something good, others will be drawn to it," she said, her voice low. "That's why we're here, to build a new kind of community, one where no one is left behind." Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face, smudged with dirt, was nevertheless radiant with a quiet strength. "I've never seen anything like this," he confessed. "The world is full of good people, Ethan," she said, a small smile on her face. "You just have to know where to look." He knew then that his journey had led him to more than just a horse. It had led him to a place and to people who saw him not as an orphan, but as a boy with a purpose. For the first time he felt he had a home, but he knew this peace was temporary. The outside world, with its greed and cruelty, would not forget about Black Lightning, and sooner or later they would come looking for him. The days that followed were a blur of hard work and a surprising sense of belonging. Ethan threw himself into the tasks of the settlement, working alongside Thomas and the other men. He helped them build a more sturdy shelter for Black Lightning, his hands, so used to the rough work of Jedediah's ranch, adapting to the new tasks with ease. He learned to speak to the Mustang with a quiet patience, earning the animal's trust one slow step at a time. The horse, in turn, seemed to recognize Ethan's genuine care. He no longer flinched when Ethan approached, and he would let the boy tend to his wound without protest. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan also learned more about the people of the settlement. There was a former blacksmith who was building a forge, a family of farmers who were clearing land for a future field, and a few old prospectors who had given up the search for gold to help build something more lasting. They were a diverse group, united by a shared dream of a better life, a life built on trust and cooperation. Sarah was always by his side. She taught him how to identify different plants and their healing properties, and he taught her how to mend fences and recognize different cattle breeds. Their friendship deepened, a quiet, unspoken understanding between two people who had found solace in each other's company. One afternoon, as they were sitting near the Mustang's enclosure, talking and watching the horse graze, Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "My father wants you to stay," she said, her voice soft. "He said you're a good worker and a good person. He said you have a place here." Ethan's heart swelled with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was a mix of overwhelming gratitude and a deep sense of trepidation. He had never been offered a place before, only a list of duties and a lifetime of scorn. "But what about the ranch?" he stammered. "Jedediah, he'll come looking for me." Sarah's expression hardened. "He can't force you to go back," she said. "You're not his property, Ethan. You're a person. You have a choice." The word choice resonated deeply within him. It was a concept he had rarely, if ever, been afforded. For so long, his life had been dictated by the whims of others. The conversation was interrupted by a rider galloping into the camp. He was a young man with a look of panic on his face. He dismounted, breathing heavily. "Jedediah's here," he panted. "He's with Sheriff Thorne. They're asking questions about a stray boy and a wild horse." Dark cold dread settled in Ethan's stomach. He knew this was coming. He looked at Sarah and then at the community he had grown to care for. He couldn't let them be endangered because of him. He was ready to face them, to tell them he was not going back. Thomas came out of his tent, his face grim. "All right," he said, his voice a low command. "We'll stand together. No one leaves, no one talks. The community rallied around him, a silent show of solidarity. They weren't just protecting a boy and a horse, they were protecting their principles, their belief in a world where kindness trumped cruelty. Ethan watched them, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the strength in their eyes, the unwavering resolve that had brought them to this harsh land. For the first time, he was not alone in his fight. He had a family, a community, and a purpose. The test was here. The sheriff was coming, and Ethan would stand and face him, not as a helpless orphan, but as a man who had found his place in the world. He was no longer just an orphan boy, he was part of something bigger. The air grew thick with tension as the two riders approached. Jedediah Cobb, his face a mask of furious self-importance, led the way, his gaze darting across the settlement with a mix of disdain and confusion. Behind him rode Sheriff Thorne, his posture radiating a chilling authority. He wore his badge like a shield, a symbol of his power over those he deemed lesser. They dismounted, their boots crunching on the dry ground. Jedediah's eyes locked onto Ethan, who stood beside Thomas, his shoulders back, his chin held high. The rancher's face flushed a deep red. "There he is," Jedediah snarled, pointing a gnarled finger. "My runaway hand, stealing my horse and my time." Thorne's gaze swept over the community, a smirk playing on his lips. "So this is your little kingdom, Thomas," he drawled, his voice oily with contempt. "Harboring runaways and stolen property, are we?" Thomas stepped forward, his expression calm and unwavering. "He's not a runaway, Jedediah. He came here on his own. And as for your horse, you know full well that's not true. He didn't come on your horse and he didn't steal anything." Thorne's eyes narrowed, his attention shifting to Ethan. "You found that Mustang, didn't you, boy?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "The one you were so foolishly looking for." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, but he held the sheriff's gaze. "He's not your horse, Sheriff," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "He's a wild animal. He belongs to no one." Thorne's laugh was a harsh, mocking sound that scraped against the quiet dignity of the settlement. "He belongs to whoever catches him, and I was the one with a bounty on his head. I'm taking him back, along with this boy who needs to learn a lesson about obedience." A ripple of protest ran through the crowd. Sarah stepped forward, her voice ringing with conviction. "He's hurt. We're tending to his wound. You can't just take an injured animal." Jedediah scoffed. "He's no good to us if he's lame. Put him down and be done with it." The callousness of his words sent a shiver of horror through the community. Ethan felt a surge of fury. He had cared for this animal, had risked his life to save it, and now these men wanted to destroy it. "He's not going anywhere," Thomas said, his voice firm, his stance resolute. The men around him, the blacksmith, the farmers, the old prospectors, all took a step forward, a silent, unified front. Thorne's eyes scanned the faces, a mix of disbelief and cold anger on his face. He was used to people cowering before him, not standing up to him. He was used to getting what he wanted. "You're protecting a criminal, Thomas," he said, his hand slowly moving towards his holster, "and obstructing justice. I can make things very difficult for you and your little community." "We're a community, Sheriff," Thomas replied, his voice still calm. "Not a little community. We believe in justice, but we also believe in compassion. A boy who saves an animal's life is no criminal in our eyes." The standoff was palpable, a clash of two different worlds. One built on power and fear, the other on community and kindness. The fate of the Mustang and of Ethan hung in the balance. Thorne saw the resolve in the faces of the people. He knew he couldn't simply ride in and take what he wanted without a fight. The law was on his side, but the hearts of these people were not. He knew that a violent confrontation here would be bad for his reputation. He would have to be smarter. "Fine," he said, a malicious glint in his eye. "We'll settle this another way. A race. That Mustang against my best horse. If my horse wins, I take the Mustang and the boy. If the Mustang wins, well, then you keep your little runaway and your worthless wild horse." Jedediah looked at Thorne, shocked. "But the horse is lame," he protested. "It can't run." Thorne ignored him, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "What do you say, boy? You think you can ride him? You'll never ride a Mustang, remember?" The words were a direct challenge, a personal taunt designed to break Ethan's spirit. A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew the Mustang was still recovering. This wasn't a fair race. It was a cruel gamble. Ethan looked at Black Lightning, who watched the scene with an intelligence that seemed to understand the stakes. He thought about Thorne's mockery, about Jedediah's cruelty, about the life of servitude he had left behind. He looked at Thomas, at Sarah, at the faces of the people who had offered him a home. He had to say yes, he had to prove them wrong. He had to fight for the horse, for himself, and for the community that had given him a chance. "I accept," Ethan said, his voice ringing out across the dusty yard, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's. "When do we start?" The terms of the race were set. The route would be a grueling one, a 20-mile loop, starting and ending at the settlement, with the turning point marked by a large, distinctive rock formation known as Sentinel's Peak. Thorne's horse, a massive, muscular roan named Goliath, was a champion racer, known for his stamina and speed. Black Lightning, a legend of the wild, was still recovering from his wound. The odds were heavily stacked against Ethan. The night before the race, a palpable tension hung over the settlement. People worked, but their conversations were subdued, their eyes filled with a quiet anxiety. They all knew what was at stake. If Ethan lost, Thorne would not only take the Mustang and the boy, but the community's spirit would be broken. They would be seen as weak, as easy prey. Ethan was a whirlwind of activity, but inside, a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He worked on Black Lightning, cleaning his leg, massaging the swollen muscles, his hands moving with a practiced care he had learned from Sarah. The Mustang stood patiently, a silent partner in their preparations. "He's still not ready," Sarah said, her voice laced with worry as she watched Ethan work. "We should have said no. It's a trap." "I had to," Ethan replied, not looking at her. "He wouldn't have let us go. This is our only chance, Sarah. It has to work." Later that evening, Thomas came to sit with Ethan. The old man placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Son, I know what you're feeling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That man, he thrives on breaking spirits. He sees a horse like that and a boy like you, and all he sees is a challenge to his power. This race isn't about speed, it's about more than that." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his gaze fixed on the horse. "It's about trust," Thomas said. "A man and a horse are a team. And a team built on trust will always be stronger than one built on fear. Thorne can break a horse with his will, but he can't win its heart. That's what you have, Ethan. That's your advantage." The words resonated with Ethan. He thought about the long days he had spent with Black Lightning, about the way the horse had let him tend to his wound, the way he would nudge his hand with his head for a bit of affection. It was a bond forged not by force, but by quiet, patient care. Ethan spent the rest of the night grooming the horse, talking to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about their journey, about the people who had given them a home. He didn't know if the horse understood the words, but he felt the animal's calm presence, a quiet strength that mirrored his own growing resolve. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the horse, for Sarah, for Thomas, for the community that had welcomed him. He was no longer just an orphan boy. He was their champion. He had one last conversation with Sarah before he went to sleep. "You're not doing this alone," she said, her green eyes filled with a determined fire. "I'll be out there. We'll be watching. We're all with you." Ethan nodded, a lump in his throat. He had come here with nothing, and now he had a community that stood behind him, a friend who believed in him, and a horse that trusted him. It was everything he had ever wanted, and he was ready to fight for it. He laid down on his bedroll, the stars twinkling in the vast dark sky, and found a quiet peace in the face of the daunting challenge. The race was a gamble, but he had something Thorne would never have, a belief in something bigger than himself. The sun rose on a clear, cold morning, painting the sky with a brilliant wash of red and gold. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the settlement, a mix of curious townsfolk and the silent, supportive community members. Jedediah and Thorne sat on their horses, their faces grim, their confidence a brittle facade. Thorne, on his powerful roan Goliath, looked like a statue carved from stone. The horse snorted, pawing the ground, its muscles rippling with barely contained power. Thorne smirked, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, a show of arrogant dominance. Ethan stood beside Black Lightning, his hand on the horse's neck. The Mustang, his coat a deep, shining black, looked magnificent, his head held high. He seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, a quiet energy thrumming beneath his skin. His injured leg was still slightly swollen, but he was putting more weight on it than before. Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. A lame horse against a champion? This won't even be a race, Thorne. It'll be a walk. Thorne only smiled, a cold, humorless expression. A man's will can make a horse fly, Jedediah. We'll see who has the stronger will. Thomas stepped forward, holding a makeshift starter's pistol. The rules are simple, he announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. 20 miles to Sentinel's Peak and back. First rider to cross this line wins. No interference, no shortcuts. Good luck to both of you. He raised the pistol, the click of the hammer a tense sound in the quiet air. Ethan looked at Sarah, who gave him a silent, encouraging nod. He looked at Thomas, at the faces of the community members who had welcomed him. He wasn't just riding for himself. He was riding for all of them. Crack! The shot echoed across the plains, and the race began. Goliath exploded forward, a blur of red and brown, his powerful legs eating up the ground. Thorne was a master horseman, his body in perfect sync with the animal's stride. They were a force of nature, a testament to speed and power. Black Lightning, in contrast, started slower. His strides were a bit tentative at first, a slight favor still given to his injured leg. Ethan didn't push him. He leaned forward, whispering words of encouragement, a silent promise that he would not force the horse beyond his limits. He had to rely on the horse's strength and, more importantly, on the bond they had built. As they moved across the vast landscape, the distance between them and Goliath grew. The roan was a speck on the horizon, a distant reminder of the impossible odds. "He's too fast," a woman in the crowd muttered. "They'll never catch him." But as the miles wore on, something changed. Goliath's initial burst of speed began to wane. The sun beat down, the heat relentless, and the long, grueling race began to take its toll. Thorne, used to breaking a horse's spirit to force it to run, was pushing his animal to its limits, his face a mask of strain. Black Lightning, on the other hand, began to find his rhythm. The initial stiffness in his leg had worked itself out, and his strides grew longer, more fluid. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, his black coat a dark flash against the brown earth. Ethan didn't push him with spurs or a whip. He rode with him, a partner in a shared effort. They made it to Sentinel's Peak, the massive rock formation a silent witness to their slow but steady progress. They turned and began the long journey back. By now, the distant speck that was Goliath was no longer so distant. They were gaining. Thorne, looking over his shoulder, saw them, a wave of shock and fury washing over his face. He began to curse, to whip Goliath, pushing the horse harder. But the horse was already spent, its lungs heaving, its powerful legs trembling with exhaustion. Black Lightning, however, seemed to have found a second wind. With the finish line in sight, he let out a powerful neigh, a sound of triumph and raw, untamed power. He surged forward, his legs a blur, his black coat shimmering in the sunlight. Ethan leaned into the ride, his heart soaring. He could hear the shouts of the crowd now, the cheers growing louder as they neared the settlement. He wasn't just a boy riding a horse. He was a boy and a horse, a single, unified force, a testament to the power of trust and freedom. They crossed the finish line in a cloud of dust, the roan and Thorne 100 yards behind, defeated and humiliated. The crowd erupted, a cheer that echoed across the plains. Ethan, breathless and exhilarated, dismounted and threw his arms around the Mustang's neck. He wasn't just a horse, he was a friend, a partner in a shared victory. Thorne, his face pale with rage, rode up to them. He looked at the boy and the magnificent, untamed horse, and for the first time the arrogance on his face was replaced by a look of bewildered defeat. He had underestimated the boy, and in doing so, he had lost. "You'll never ride a Mustang," he had mocked. But Ethan had done more than just ride him. He had won his heart, and in that moment, in the dust and the cheers of a community that had given him a home, Ethan knew he was finally free. He had faced his demons, won against impossible odds, and found his place in the world. The story, however, was far from over. The victory was not a roar, but a profound, emotional silence. The cheers had died down, and the crowd stood in a state of stunned disbelief. Thorne, red-faced and humiliated, mounted Goliath and rode off without a word, followed by a defeated-looking Jedediah. The sheriff's authority, so long built on fear and intimidation, had been shattered by the trust between a boy and a wild horse. Ethan, his heart still thrumming with adrenaline, led Black Lightning back to his enclosure. His hands, though tired, moved with a gentle reverence as he tended to the horse. He cleaned the last bit of mud from his coat, checked his leg, and offered him water. The Mustang drank deeply, then nuzzled Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of silent gratitude that spoke more than words ever could. Sarah walked up to him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it, Ethan." He looked at her, and for the first time he saw a future that wasn't dictated by the cruelty of others. He saw a life he could build, a place he could call home. "We did it, Sarah," he corrected, a quiet smile on his face. "You helped me. All of you did." Thomas approached, a proud fatherly smile on his face. He extended his hand, and Ethan shook it firmly. "You proved a man's worth today, Ethan," Thomas said. "Not by brute force, but by heart. You showed them what a real man is made of." The rest of the day was a celebration. The small community, buoyed by the victory, was filled with a newfound joy. A fire was built, and food was shared. Ethan was no longer just the orphan boy who had stumbled into their lives. He was one of them, a hero in his own right. The children looked at him with admiration, the adults with respect. That night, as the stars came out, Ethan sat by the fire, the warmth a comforting presence against the cool desert air. Sarah sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "My father wants to make a formal offer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A place for you, to live and work with us, to be a part of our community. He wants you to stay." Ethan's heart swelled. He had been offered a job before, a place to eat and sleep in exchange for a lifetime of thankless labor. This was different. This was an invitation to belong, to be part of a family. He didn't need to think. "Yes," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I want to stay, more than anything." Sarah smiled, and the firelight danced in her green eyes. There was an unspoken promise in that smile, a promise of a shared future, a future where they would build a home together, not just for themselves, but for a whole community. He knew that the sheriff's defeat was not the end of his troubles. Thorne was not a man to accept humiliation easily. He would be back, and his revenge would be swift and cruel. But for the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't afraid. He had a family, a community, and a friend. And he had Black Lightning, the magnificent creature who had shown him the true meaning of freedom. He was ready for whatever came next. Back at his ranch, Sheriff Thorne seethed with a cold, venomous rage. The memory of the boy, the horse, and the cheering crowd replayed in his mind, each time fueling his fury. He had been made a fool of, his authority publicly mocked. This was not a defeat he could simply shrug off. It was a wound to his pride, and he was determined to make Ethan pay. Jedediah Cobb, who had been riding in a state of bewildered silence, dismounted and watched Thorne pace. "Thorne, we're better off without that wild horse. It was an unnecessary risk." "Unnecessary!" Thorne bellowed, his voice filled with menace. "I was humiliated, Jedediah, in front of half the county. That boy and that horse made a mockery of me. They won't get away with it." Jedediah, a man who understood a grudge, saw the dangerous glint in Thorne's eyes. "So what's your plan? You can't just ride in and take them. They'll stand against you again. That Thomas fellow has a whole camp of people who'll protect them." Thorne stopped pacing, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He was not a man of honor, and a fair fight was not his style. He was a man of the law, but he saw the law as a tool, a weapon to be used against those who dared to defy him. "You're right," Thorne said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I can't take them head-on, not yet, but I can cripple them. A man who wants to build a home needs a strong foundation, and I know a few ways to make a foundation crumble." He pulled a map from his saddlebag, an old, worn piece of parchment. It was a survey of the land around the settlement, a map he had acquired a while back. He pointed to a spot on the map, a line drawn by a surveyor's hand. "The creek," he said, his voice a low growl. "Their only source of water. It runs through a small tributary a few miles north of their camp. If that water is diverted or poisoned..." Jedediah's eyes widened in horror. "You can't do that, Thorne. People will die." "Collateral damage," Thorne said, his gaze as cold as a winter wind. "A lesson to them all. They dared to challenge me. They need to learn their place. Besides," he added, a glint of perverse logic in his eyes, "I'm not poisoning the water. I'm just rerouting it. What happens after is not my concern." Jedediah, for all his cruelty, was a coward. He was a man who worked within the bounds of what he saw as acceptable brutality. This was different. This was a line he wasn't willing to cross. "I want no part of this, Thorne," he said, his voice trembling. "You're already a part of it, Jedediah," Thorne replied, his voice a chilling threat. "You helped me try to capture the horse. You're my witness. If anything happens to me, or to this land, you'll be the first one to take the fall. I have your name on a document." He gestured to a sealed envelope on his desk. Jedediah paled, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. He was trapped, a pawn in Thorne's twisted game of revenge. Meanwhile, at the settlement, the celebration was winding down. The fire crackled, and the stars hung like diamonds in the inky sky. Ethan, settled in his new tent, found himself feeling a peace he had never known before. He had a future here, a place to belong, and the thought filled him with a quiet joy. He didn't know that miles away in the dark of night, a plan was being hatched. A plan that would threaten not only his new home, but the lives of every person who had helped him. The sheriff's rage was a storm on the horizon, a storm that would not be content with a simple victory. It wanted destruction. The days after the race were filled with a deceptive calm. The air was cool, the sun was warm, and the work of building the new community continued with renewed energy. They cleared land, built more permanent structures, and began to plan for the future. Ethan, now a full member of the community, was always in the thick of it, his hands busy, his heart full. But a few days into this newfound peace, a troubling sign appeared. The creek, the community's lifeblood, began to slow. At first it was barely noticeable, a subtle decrease in the flow, but each day the water level dropped a little more and the flow became more sluggish. "It's the drought," a few people said, shrugging it off. "It's been a dry year." But Thomas, a man who had lived off the land his entire life, was worried. He had an intimate knowledge of the local waterways, and he knew that even in a dry year, the creek should have more water. He gathered a small team, including Ethan and a few other experienced hands, to ride upstream and investigate. They rode for miles, following the winding path of the creek. The air grew still, the silence of the land a stark contrast to the lively bustle of the camp. As they rode further, the creek bed grew drier and drier, until it was nothing more than a shallow trickle. Finally, they reached a point where the creek made a sharp turn, and there they saw it. The creek was almost completely blocked by a large pile of rocks and debris, a deliberate obstruction that had clearly been placed there by human hands. A small channel had been dug, diverting the water into a new, smaller stream that ran off into the dry, unforgiving desert. A wave of dread washed over Ethan. This was no accident. This was a deliberate act of sabotage, a plan to cripple the community, to drive them out. Thomas's face, usually so calm and kind, was a mask of grim determination. "This is Thorne's doing," he said, his voice low and filled with a cold fury. "No one else would have the audacity or the malice." Ethan's blood ran cold. He had thought the race was the end of it, the final word. He had been wrong. Thorne's revenge was more insidious, more dangerous than he could have imagined. He wasn't just targeting him, he was targeting everyone who had helped him. They worked quickly to clear the obstruction, their hands moving with a desperate urgency. The rocks were heavy, and the work was slow, but they were fueled by a shared sense of outrage. As they worked, Ethan noticed something strange. Her small, shiny object buried beneath a rock. He picked it up. It was a tarnished silver button of a type he had seen on Sheriff Thorne's uniform. A calling card, a taunt, a clear sign that this was no accident. They managed to clear the blockage by nightfall, the water rushing forward with a new, life-giving force. As they rode back to the camp, their horses tired and their bodies aching, a heavy silence hung in the air. The victory of the race, the hope of a new home, now seemed fragile. The illusion of safety had been shattered. When they returned to the settlement, the news spread like wildfire. The initial shock gave way to a quiet resolve. No one spoke of leaving. They had built this community on a promise of a better life, and they were not about to abandon it now. That night, gathered around the fire, Thomas looked at Ethan, his face grave. "He's not going to stop, Ethan," he said. "He's a man who has lost face. He will not rest until he has destroyed everything we've built." Ethan knew this was true. The sheriff's hatred was a living, breathing thing, but so was the community's resolve. He looked at the faces around the fire, at the children sleeping in their tents, at Sarah, who sat beside him, her hand in his. He had a home here, and he would not let a man like Thorne take it from him. He had to find a way to stop him for good, before it was too late. The days that followed were a testament to the community's resilience. They organized patrols to watch the creek, and they worked tirelessly to reinforce their defenses. The men who had been building the forge now focused on creating tools for a long-term water system. The farmers who had been clearing the land now stood guard. The air was thick with a quiet determination, a shared sense of purpose. But Ethan knew this wasn't a sustainable solution. They couldn't live in a constant state of fear, constantly waiting for Thorne's next act of sabotage. They needed a more permanent solution, a way to end the threat for good. He spent his nights in a state of restless contemplation. He watched the stars, the same stars he had watched with Sarah in the canyon, and he thought about the past. He thought about Jedediah's cruelty, about Thorne's mockery. He knew that their power was not in their strength, but in the fear they inspired. If he could remove that fear, he could remove their power. He spoke to Thomas, to Sarah, and to a few of the other men. His idea was a bold one, a desperate gamble that could either save them or destroy them. "We have to expose him," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "We have to show the world who he really is, a man who would poison a community for revenge, a man who would ruin lives just to save face." Thomas listened, his face thoughtful. "It won't be easy," he said. "He's the law. People are afraid to speak against him." "We won't just speak," Ethan said. "We'll show them. We'll expose his corruption. We'll show them the truth about what he's been doing. But we can't do it alone. We need help." His plan was to travel to the nearest town, a place called Redemption Creek, and find a way to get the word out. He would tell the story of the sabotage, of the sheriff's cruelty, and he would use the silver button he had found as proof. "He'll be watching for you," Sarah said, her voice filled with a motherly concern. "He'll know you're the one who found the evidence. It's too dangerous, Ethan. He'll kill you." "Maybe," Ethan said, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "But I have to try. I can't live a life looking over my shoulder, and I won't let him destroy everything you've built." He knew the danger. He knew that Thorne, a man who saw no bounds to his power, would not hesitate to kill a boy who threatened his authority. But for the first time in his life, Ethan felt a sense of purpose that was greater than his fear. He was fighting for a home, for a family, for a way of life that he had only just discovered. The community, after much debate, agreed to support his plan. They gave him supplies, a fresh horse, and their unwavering support. They knew the risk, but they also knew that they had no other choice. This was their only hope. The night before his departure, Ethan went to Black Lightning's enclosure. The horse, sensing his master's unease, came forward and nudged his hand. Ethan stroked his neck, his mind racing with 100 thoughts. "I'm leaving, boy," he whispered. "Just for a little while. I have to do this. I have to protect our home." He knew that the journey would be a treacherous one. Thorne was a master of the land, and he would be watching. But Ethan also knew that he had something Thorne would never have: the strength of a community, the trust of a wild horse, and a purpose that was more powerful than any weapon. He was no longer just an orphan boy. He was a champion, and he was ready for the fight of his life. The journey to Redemption Creek was a long and arduous one. Ethan rode for days, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his heart a drumbeat of anticipation and fear. He avoided the main roads, taking the winding, lesser-known trails, a silent promise to stay safe for the people who had put their trust in him. He carried with him the silver button, a small but powerful piece of evidence that could expose the sheriff's treachery. He knew that the moment he stepped into Redemption Creek, he would be a target. Thorne's influence extended far beyond his own county, and he had friends in high places. On the third day of his journey, as the sun began to set, he saw a familiar figure on the horizon. It was Jedediah Cobb, riding alone, his head down, his posture slumped with defeat. Ethan's first instinct was to hide, to avoid the man who had tormented him for so long, but a flicker of an idea took root in his mind. He rode out to meet him, his hand on the reins, his heart pounding. Jedediah looked up, a look of surprise and then fear on his face. "What are you doing here, boy?" he said, his voice a low growl. "I want no trouble with you." "I'm not looking for trouble, Jedediah," Ethan said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I'm looking for the truth." He told Jedediah about the sabotaged creek, about the silver button he had found. He told him about Thorne's plan to destroy the community, a plan that would cost innocent lives. Jedediah listened, his face a mix of fear and inner turmoil. He was a greedy man, a cruel man, but he was not a murderer. Thorne had gone too far. "He threatened me," Jedediah said, his voice low and defeated. "He said he'd have me arrested if I didn't keep my mouth shut. He has something, a document with my name on it." "He's a liar, Jedediah," Ethan said. "He's a man who thrives on fear. He's using you just like he's using everyone else. If you help me, if you tell the truth, we can bring him down together. You can be free." Jedediah looked at the boy who had once been his servant, the boy he had once scorned. He saw a quiet strength in his eyes, a resolve that he had never possessed. He saw a chance for redemption, a chance to free himself from a man who had corrupted his life and his soul. With a heavy sigh, Jedediah nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll help you. I'll go to the sheriff's office and find that document. But you have to promise me you won't tell anyone about the horse or about the race." Ethan, knowing that he needed Jedediah's help, agreed. He knew the man was a coward, but he also knew that even the most corrupt men had a breaking point, and Thorne had crossed it. As they rode together towards Redemption Creek, a strange camaraderie formed between them. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, but a silent alliance. They were two men, two very different men, united by a common enemy. When they arrived, the town was a bustling hub of activity. The saloon was filled with people, the general store was busy, and the local sheriff's office was a place of authority. Jedediah, using an old alibi, slipped away, a ghost in the crowd. Ethan, now alone and with a new sense of urgency, walked towards the town center. He had to find someone who would listen, someone who would believe him. He had to make sure his journey was not in vain. He was no longer just running. He was fighting. Ethan's search for an ally was a difficult one. He was just a boy, and the people of Redemption Creek were a wary, cynical lot. He tried to speak to a few townsfolk, but they were either too afraid or too dismissive to listen to his wild tale of a corrupt sheriff. He was just about to give up when he heard a voice from the shadows. "You're looking for someone to help you," the voice said, a low, raspy sound. Ethan turned to see an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. He was sitting on a bench outside the saloon, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. "I heard your story," the old man said, "and I believe you. I've known Thorne for years. He's always been a snake in the grass. He uses the law as a shield for his cruelty, but a man can only get away with so much." The old man introduced himself as Silas, a retired prospector who had seen a lot in his life. He was a man who had a deep-seated hatred for men like Thorne, men who exploited others for their own gain. "I can help you," Silas said, his eyes filled with a new purpose. "I know a few people who can get your story out, but we'll need proof, something more than a button." Ethan told him about Jedediah, about the document Thorne had, and about his plan to use it to expose him. Silas nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That's a good start," he said, "but we'll need more. We'll need to go to the heart of the matter, the water source." Silas, a man who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the land, led Ethan to a secluded back room of the saloon. He unrolled a map, a detailed map of the entire region. He pointed to the location of the settlement and the creek. He showed Ethan another part of the map, a section that detailed an old forgotten mine, a mine that had been a major source of conflict years ago. "The water from that creek, it runs to that mine," Silas said, his voice low. "Thorne bought that mine years ago. He told everyone it was a lost cause, a money pit, but I have a feeling he knows something we don't." Ethan's mind raced. What if the creek wasn't just a means of revenge? What if it was a means to an end? What if Thorne was diverting the water to his mine, a mine that had a secret of its own? Silas looked at Ethan, his gaze steady. "We need to go to that mine. We need to find the truth, whatever it is, and we need to do it before Jedediah gets cold feet and turns you in." Ethan knew this was a dangerous gamble. He was no longer just fighting for a home. He was fighting for the truth. He was fighting to expose a man who had corrupted an entire region. He looked at the old man, a man who had a weary wisdom and a heart full of justice. He was an unlikely ally, but he was exactly the kind of ally he needed. They were two men, a young boy and a grizzled old man, united by a shared purpose. As they made their plan, a sense of quiet determination settled over Ethan. He had started this journey to prove a point to a bully. He had ended up in a fight for a community, for a home, and now for justice. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt a sense of control. He was no longer running. He was fighting. The journey to the old mine was a treacherous one. It was a place of forgotten dreams and buried secrets, a place where the sun beat down on the cracked earth and the wind howled through the empty shafts. Silas, with his years of experience, led the way, his eyes sharp, his movements cautious. "This place has a bad reputation," Silas said, his voice low. "People say it's haunted, but I've always thought it was haunted by something else, something more tangible than a ghost." As they neared the mine, the landscape became more and more desolate. The creek, which should have been running strong and true, was a dry, dusty line in the earth. The air was thick with the scent of dried-up earth and old memories. They found the mine, a dark, gaping hole in the earth, and as they went inside, they found what they were looking for. The mine wasn't abandoned. It was a secret operation, a hidden network of tunnels and shafts. They found evidence of recent work, of equipment being moved, and of men who had been working in the shadows. But the most damning evidence was the water. A new tunnel had been dug, a tunnel that diverted the creek's water directly into the mine. It wasn't being used for drinking. It was being used to power a hidden operation. But what? They went deeper, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the dark. They found a small room, and inside they found it. Not gold, not silver, but something far more valuable. It was a hidden spring, a massive underground reservoir of water. The water was pure, clean, and a source of life in a world that was constantly thirsty. The creek, it was a fake, Silas said, his voice filled with a stunned disbelief. It was a diversion. This is the real source of water. Thorne, he's been selling it. He's been hoarding the water, and he's been selling it to the highest bidder. A wave of shock and disgust washed over Ethan. Thorne wasn't just a bully. He was a thief, a man who would hoard the most valuable resource in the West for his own gain. The sabotage of the creek was just a part of a much larger plan. He was trying to cripple the community, not just for revenge, but to force them to buy water from him, at whatever price he saw fit. They also found a set of ledgers hidden in a dusty corner. The ledgers detailed Thorne's transactions, the names of the ranchers he had sold water to, the money he had made, and a letter, a recent one that mentioned a big deal with a powerful land baron who wanted to buy a massive amount of water to irrigate his fields, a deal that would make Thorne a very rich man. Ethan and Silas had all the proof they needed. They had the evidence, the ledgers, the letter, and the truth. They had to get back to Redemption Creek, they had to expose him, and they had to do it before it was too late. As they rode back, a new sense of urgency filled them. The threat was no longer a personal vendetta. It was a systemic corruption, a threat to the very fabric of the West. They were not just fighting for a community. They were fighting for justice. They were fighting to expose a man who would hoard a resource for his own gain and let people suffer. When they arrived back at Redemption Creek, they found Jedediah waiting for them, a look of grim relief on his face. He held a small, sealed envelope in his hands, the document with his name on it. "I did it," he said, his voice trembling. "I found it. The sheriff's office is closed for the night, but I'll make sure it's delivered to the right person tomorrow. Now, about that deal." Ethan took the envelope, a look of profound gratitude on his face. He knew that Jedediah was still a self-serving man, but in this moment he had chosen to do the right thing. "Thank you, Jedediah," Ethan said, his voice full of a quiet respect. "You've done a good thing. Now we have to expose him. We have all the proof we need, and we'll do it tomorrow for everyone." The next morning, the air in Redemption Creek was thick with a palpable tension. The news of the sabotage at the creek had spread, and the townsfolk, already wary of Thorne, were a mix of outrage and disbelief. Ethan, Silas, and Jedediah stood in the center of town, a small crowd gathering around them. Ethan held the ledgers, Silas held the map, and Jedediah held the document that would free him from Thorne's grasp. They were ready. The doors to the sheriff's office swung open, and Thorne stepped out, a smug, arrogant look on his face. He saw the crowd, and his smile faltered. He saw Ethan, and his eyes narrowed with a cold, murderous fury. "What is the meaning of this, boy?" he said, his voice a low growl. "Are you here to cause more trouble?" "I'm here for justice, Sheriff," Ethan said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'm here to expose you for what you are. A thief, a liar. A man who would ruin lives for his own gain," Thorne scoffed, but a flicker of fear danced in his eyes. "You have nothing, boy, just a wild tale and a wilder imagination." "I have more than that, Sheriff," Ethan said. "I have proof, the ledgers, the map, and the truth." He unrolled the map, and Silas, his voice a low, steady rumble, explained the hidden spring, the diverted water, and the secret operation. The crowd gasped, their faces a mix of shock and betrayal. "It's a lie!" Thorne roared, his face turning a deep crimson. "It's a conspiracy! This boy and this old drunk are trying to frame me!" "And what about me, Sheriff?" Jedediah said, his voice shaking with a newfound courage. He stepped forward, holding the document. "What about this? The document that says I'm in charge of your dirty little business? The one you used to threaten me?" Thorne's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never expected Jedediah to turn on him. The man he had so easily manipulated had found his courage, and in doing so he had sealed Thorne's fate. A town elder, a man of quiet authority, stepped forward. "Sheriff Thorne, these are serious accusations. You have been a man of power in this town for a long time, but we will not stand for this. We will have a trial, a fair trial." Thorne looked at the faces around him, the faces of the people he had once ruled with an iron fist. He saw no fear, only anger and a righteous indignation. He was defeated. He was exposed. He was a man who had lost everything. He lunged forward, his hand going for his gun. But before he could even draw it, Silas, with a speed that belied his age, had his own pistol pointed at Thorne's head. "The time for games is over, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice as steady as a rock. "The people have spoken. You're no longer the law. You're a criminal." Thorne, defeated and humiliated, lowered his hand. The crowd closed in on him, their anger a living, breathing thing. The men who had once feared him now held him captive. The victory was not a roar, but a profound, emotional silence. The people of Redemption Creek had found their courage, and they had taken their town back. Ethan, standing in the middle of it all, felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had exposed the truth. He had fought for justice. But he knew that the fight was not over. The community was safe. The sheriff was gone, but the past was still there, a ghost of a memory that would haunt him for a long time. He had to go home, to the community that had given him a home, and to the horse that had taught him the true meaning of freedom. He was no longer a boy running from his past. He was a man riding towards his future. The return journey was a different kind of trip. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, triumphant peace. Ethan, riding with Silas and Jedediah, felt a sense of camaraderie he had never known. Jedediah, for his part, was a changed man. The weight of Thorne's threats was gone, and he felt a quiet, if reluctant, sense of relief. He wasn't a hero, not by a long shot, but he had chosen to do the right thing, and in doing so, he had found a measure of peace. As they rode, Ethan told them about the community, about Thomas, about Sarah, and about Black Lightning. He spoke of the kindness they had shown him, the hope they had given him, and the home they had built. Silas, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, listened with a quiet, thoughtful expression. "A good man in a bad world is a light in the darkness," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have found a home, son, a real home, and a true friend. Don't ever forget that." Jedediah, surprisingly, agreed. "You're lucky, boy," he said. "You found people who saw a man in you, even when you were just a boy. That's worth more than all the gold in the world." Ethan looked at the two men, and he saw a strange kind of kinship. One, a man of honor, the other a man who had lost his way, but had found it again. They were his allies, his friends, and in a way his family. When they arrived back at the settlement, the community rushed out to greet them. The news of Thorne's arrest had already spread, and they were a mix of relief and joy. Sarah, seeing Ethan, ran to him, her face a mix of worry and relief. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to disappear. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're home." The reunion was a joyful one. A fire was built, and food was shared. Ethan told them everything about his journey, about the mine, about Silas, and about Jedediah's help. The community listened, their faces a mix of pride and awe. They had faced a powerful enemy, and they had won. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, a peaceful smile on his face. He looked at the faces around him, the faces of the people who had given him a home, a purpose, and a family. He looked at Sarah, who sat beside him, her hand in his, and he looked at Black Lightning, who was sleeping peacefully in his enclosure, a symbol of the freedom they had fought for. He had started this journey with nothing but a dream and a heart full of defiance. He had ended up with a home, a purpose, a family, and a friend. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning. He was no longer the orphan boy. He was Ethan, the man who had tamed a Mustang and in doing so, had found his own place in the world. He was home. The news of Thorne's arrest and the discovery of his hidden water operation spread like wildfire across the plains. Word reached the state capital, and a new sheriff was appointed to take Thorne's place. His name was Marshal John Stone, a man known for his honesty and integrity, a stark contrast to the man he was replacing. Stone arrived in Redemption Creek a few days later, a tall, imposing figure with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to the town elders, to Silas's detailed account of the hidden mine, and to Ethan's story of the creek's sabotage. He interviewed Jedediah, who, now free from Thorne's grasp, spoke the truth with a newfound courage. Stone was a man of the law, but he was also a man who believed in justice. He saw the truth in their eyes, and he saw the relief on the faces of the people who had been living under the thumb of a corrupt official. He made a promise to the town. He would see Thorne brought to justice, and he would do everything in his power to restore trust in the law. He rode out to the settlement, his visit unannounced. The community was wary at first, but Stone's genuine sincerity and respect for their hard-won victory quickly won them over. He spoke to Thomas, to Sarah, and to the other men and women who had stood up to Thorne. He saw a community built on a foundation of compassion and cooperation, a stark contrast to the greed that had nearly destroyed them. He asked to speak to Ethan alone. They walked to Black Lightning's enclosure, the marshal's long strides matching Ethan's. Stone's eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the magnificent horse, the still visible scars on its leg, and the deep, unspoken bond between the boy and the animal. "I've heard the story, son," Stone said, his voice a low rumble. "About the race, the sabotage, the whole thing. What you did, it wasn't just brave. It was a testament to what's right. You showed the people that the law isn't a weapon for the powerful, but a shield for the innocent." Ethan, unaccustomed to such praise, lowered his gaze. "I just did what was right," he said. Stone smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "And that's the difference between a good man and a bad one. A good man does what's right, even when it's hard. A bad man does what's easy, even when it's wrong." He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of respect and admiration. "I have a proposition for you, son," he said. "I'm looking for a deputy. A man who knows this land, who knows what's right, and who isn't afraid to stand up for it. I want you to be that man. You have the respect of these people, and you have a good heart. This town, this whole county, needs a man like you." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. A deputy. The offer was staggering. A few weeks ago he was a nameless orphan, a boy living under the boot of a tyrant. Now he was being offered a position of authority, a chance to make a real difference, to stand on the side of justice. He thought about the community, about Thomas, about Sarah, and about Black Lightning. He had found a home, but he also had a new purpose. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a man with a future. "Yes, sir," Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I'll do it. I'll be your deputy." Stone nodded, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He saw not just a boy, but a future where a man's worth was measured not by his power, but by his honor. The months that followed were a time of great change for the community. With Thorne's reign of terror over and Marshal Stone at the helm, the settlement began to flourish. The men and women, now free from the constant threat of sabotage, worked with a renewed energy. The new sheriff's presence was a symbol of hope, a promise of a new kind of law, one built on trust and cooperation. Ethan, now Marshal Stone's deputy, threw himself into his new role with a quiet determination. He learned the ropes of the law, but he also brought his own unique perspective to the job. He was a man of the people, a man who had known hardship, and he treated every person with the respect and empathy he had so rarely received. He worked with Marshal Stone to bring Thorne's accomplices to justice, to unravel his web of corruption, and to right the wrongs he had committed. They returned the stolen money to the ranchers who had been forced to buy water from him. They helped the community secure a new, more reliable water source, and they worked to build a new, more just system. Ethan's relationship with Black Lightning deepened with each passing day. The horse, now fully recovered, was a constant companion. They would ride the dusty trails together, a silent, powerful team. The Mustang was a symbol of freedom, and Ethan was a living testament to its power. The boy who had once been a prisoner of his circumstances was now a man who was building a future for himself and for others. He spent his evenings with Sarah and her family, the evenings a blur of laughter, conversation, and a quiet sense of peace. Sarah and Ethan's relationship grew, a beautiful, gentle bond that was a source of comfort and strength for them both. They would sit by the fire, their shoulders touching, and talk about their dreams for the future. "This is what we wanted," Sarah would say, her eyes shining in the firelight. "This is what we came here for. A place to call home, a place where we can be free." Ethan would nod, his gaze fixed on the stars. He had found more than just a home. He had found a purpose. He had found a family. He was no longer a lone rider on a desperate quest. He was a man with a community, a friend, and a destiny. The story of the orphan boy and the wild Mustang became a legend in the area. A story of a boy who, with nothing but courage and a pure heart, had stood up to a tyrant and won. It was a story that gave hope to the downtrodden, a story that reminded people that a single act of kindness could change a life, and a single act of courage could change a community. But Ethan knew that the work was far from over. The West was a wild and unforgiving place, and there were always new challenges on the horizon. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. He had faced his demons, he had won his freedom, and he was ready for whatever came next. He was a man of the West now, and his story was just beginning. Just as the community began to settle into a new, peaceful routine, a shadow from the past returned to haunt them. A letter arrived for Marshal Stone, a thick, official-looking document with a seal on it. Stone's face grew grim as he read it. He called Ethan into his office, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "The state has decided," Stone said, his voice low. "Thorne's trial is set, but there's a problem. His lawyers are arguing that the evidence is circumstantial, that Jedediah's testimony is unreliable, and that they need more. They want someone to testify, someone who was there, someone who can tell the story of what happened." Ethan's heart sank. He knew what that meant. He was the one who had discovered the sabotage, the one who had found the button. He was the most credible witness they had. He would have to go to the capital, a journey that would take weeks, a journey that would take him away from the home he had just found. "It's the only way to be sure he stays in prison," Stone said, his gaze steady. "They have powerful friends, Ethan. They want to get him out. If they succeed, he'll come back, and he'll be angrier and more dangerous than ever before." Ethan knew this was true. Thorne was not a man to forget a grudge. The thought of him returning, of the shadow of his cruelty once again falling over the community, was a terrifying one. "I'll do it," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll go." The news of his departure sent a wave of concern through the community. Sarah was worried sick. She pleaded with him to reconsider, to let someone else go, but Ethan was resolute. He had started this, and he would see it through to the end. "I have to, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I can't let him get away with it. I can't let him threaten our home again." She understood, of course. She knew that his sense of duty was as strong as his desire for a peaceful life. She helped him prepare for the journey, packing his bags, making sure he had enough food and water. She gave him a small hand-carved piece of wood, a tiny horse. "For luck," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "and to remind you that we'll be waiting for you." Ethan hugged her tightly, the carved horse a warm weight in his hand. He promised to write, to be careful, and to come back as soon as he could. He saddled Black Lightning, the horse a silent, knowing presence. The Mustang had been with him since the beginning of this journey, a constant companion, a symbol of his strength and his freedom. Now he would be his partner on this final leg of the journey to justice. As they rode out of the settlement, the sun rose, painting the sky with a beautiful wash of color. Ethan looked back at the community, at the faces of the people who had given him a home. He knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had a family, a community, and a purpose. He was ready to face the shadows of the past, to fight for a future that was worth living. The journey to the capital was a long and solitary one. The wide-open plains gave way to rolling hills, and then to dense forests. Ethan and Black Lightning traveled for weeks, the miles a monotonous blur of scenery and motion. Ethan would write letters to Sarah and the community, long, rambling letters that spoke of his journey, his fears and his hopes. He would leave them with passing riders, hoping they would find their way to the settlement. He had a constant sense of unease, a feeling that he was being watched. He took every precaution, avoiding towns and staying off the main roads. He knew that Thorne's powerful friends would be watching for him, a boy who could send their friend to prison for the rest of his life. One night, as he was making camp by a small stream, he heard the sound of hooves. He quickly doused his fire and hid in the shadows, his hand on his revolver. The riders were two men, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats. They were talking about a boy, a deputy, a witness. They were looking for him. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He knew he was in danger. He waited, his breathing shallow, until the riders were gone. He didn't make a fire that night. He slept with one eye open, the horse a silent, protective presence beside him. The next day he was even more cautious. He rode for miles, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. He was no longer just a boy on a journey. He was a man with a purpose, and he was being hunted. He knew he had to reach the capital to tell his story, to make sure Thorne stayed in prison. He thought about the community, about Sarah, about Thomas, and about the trust they had placed in him. He knew he couldn't fail. He had to face his fears, he had to be strong, and he had to fight for the justice they deserved. As he rode, he thought about the past. He thought about the day he had set out on his quest to find Black Lightning. He had been a boy with nothing but a dream. Now he was a man with a purpose. He had a home, a family, and a destiny. He was fighting for a future that was worth living, a future that was worth risking his life for. He also thought about Thorne, a man who had everything, a man who had used his power to oppress others. Thorne was a man of greed, a man of fear, but he was also a man who was defeated. He had lost his power, his authority, and his reputation, and in the end, he would lose his freedom. Ethan, a boy who had once been nothing, was now a man who was fighting for justice. He was no longer running, he was riding, and he was not going to stop until he reached his destination. He was a living testament to the power of a single act of courage, a single act of kindness, and a single act of hope. He was a symbol of a new West, a West built on compassion, not on greed. The capital was a bustling, chaotic city, a world away from the quiet solitude of the plains. Carriages rattled down the cobbled streets. People rushed past in a blur of motion, and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and city life. Ethan, a boy who had only known the wide-open spaces of the West, felt a sense of disorientation, of unease. He found his way to the courthouse, a massive, imposing building made of brick and stone. He was met by Marshal Stone, who had arrived earlier and was waiting for him. Stone looked at him, a flicker of relief and pride in his eyes. "You made it," Stone said, his voice a low rumble. "I was starting to worry." Ethan nodded, his heart a drumbeat of anticipation. "I'm ready," he said. They were ushered into a small, quiet room, where they met with the prosecutor, a serious-looking man named Mr. Peterson. Ethan told his story from the day he had first heard of Black Lightning to the moment he had found the evidence in the old mine. He spoke with a quiet passion, his voice filled with a conviction that came from a deep, personal knowledge of the events. Mr. Peterson listened, his gaze fixed on Ethan's face. He asked questions, and Ethan answered them, his words a steady stream of truth. When he was finished, Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Your testimony is powerful, young man," he said. "It's the heart of our case. But it won't be easy. Thorne's lawyer. He's a snake in the grass. He'll try to discredit you, to make you look like a liar, to make your story sound like a wild tale." Ethan knew this was true. He had faced Thorne's mockery before. He knew that the man would stop at nothing to save his own skin. But he was no longer the frightened orphan boy. He was a man with a purpose, a man who was fighting for justice. The trial began a few days later. The courtroom was a grand, intimidating place, filled with people in fancy clothes and serious faces. Thorne sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of cold arrogance. He looked at Ethan, and a cruel, knowing smile played on his lips. Ethan took the stand, his heart pounding in his chest. He took the oath and he began to tell his story. He spoke of the race, of the creek, of the silver button, and of the hidden mine. He spoke of the community, of their hope and their courage, and of the man who had tried to destroy it all. He was articulate, poised, and powerful. The people in the courtroom listened, their faces a mix of shock and awe. This was not a boy telling a story. This was a man speaking the truth. But then Thorne's lawyer, a slick, oily man with a sharp tongue, began his cross-examination. He questioned Ethan's character, his motives, his story. He tried to make him look like a liar, a dreamer, a boy who had fabricated a story to get his revenge. "Isn't it true, young man," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with condescension, "that you were a runaway, that you had a grudge against the former sheriff, that you concocted this story to get your revenge?" Ethan held his gaze, his voice steady. "I was not a runaway," he said. "I was an orphan who was being exploited. And my story, it's not about revenge. It's about justice. It's about a man who would ruin lives for his own gain. It's about a community that found its courage, and a horse that taught me what it means to be free." The courtroom was silent. The lawyer had no more questions. The jury, a mix of ranchers, farmers, and city folk, looked at Ethan with a new respect. They saw the truth in his eyes, the honesty in his voice, and the courage in his heart. The trial was far from over, but Ethan had won the first battle. He had told his story, and he had made them believe. The trial lasted for days that felt like weeks, a grueling succession of testimonies and legal machinations designed to dissect every moment of the truth. Witnesses were called from all corners of the county, their voices adding layers to the tapestry of corruption Thorne had woven. Silas, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the land and its ancient water systems, proved to be a formidable witness for the prosecution. He stood at the witness stand, a sturdy, weathered man, and with the aid of a detailed map he had meticulously drawn, he laid bare the former sheriff's entire water diversion system. He explained the hidden valves, the intricate network of buried pipes, and the carefully concealed pump station that had been siphoning water from the creek and diverting it to Thorne's clandestine mine. His testimony was technical and irrefutable, leaving Thorne's lawyer, a slick city man with an air of superiority, visibly frustrated. Then came Jedediah. Summoned by Marshal Stone, the old ranch hand gave a reluctant but truthful testimony. His voice was shaky, his hands trembled as he clutched the railing of the witness box, but his words were firm. He recounted the threats Thorne had made, the constant fear he had lived under, and the desperate act of placing the silver button as a marker, a silent cry for help. The lawyer tried to tear him down, to portray him as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But Jedediah's genuine fear and the simple, unembellished honesty of his story resonated deeply with the jury. The ledgers, the documents, and the tarnished silver button were all presented as evidence, each item a powerful, silent witness that spoke louder than any man's words. The button, a simple piece of metal, was the final, devastating nail in Thorne's coffin, a symbol of a man's casual cruelty and a boy's quiet heroism. Thorne, for his part, remained a pillar of defiance, a man who refused to believe his world was crumbling around him. He scowled at every piece of evidence, he sneered at every witness, and he whispered to his lawyer with a frantic intensity, his eyes filled with a simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He was a man who had been used to getting his way, a man who had never faced a real challenge, and the humiliation of a public trial was a bitter pill to swallow. He had always seen himself as a king, a man above the law, and now he was a caged beast, powerless to fight the tide of truth that was slowly but surely drowning him. The closing arguments were a powerful and emotional summation of the case. Mr. Peterson, the prosecutor, spoke with a fiery passion, his voice filling the courtroom as he painted a picture of Thorne's greed and betrayal. He spoke of the human cost, of the ranchers who had lost their livelihoods, of the community that had been on the brink of collapse, and of the courage of a young boy who had risked everything for justice. He held up the silver button for all to see, a small, tarnished piece of metal that was a powerful symbol of a man's inhumanity and a boy's unwavering spirit. Thorne's lawyer, in turn, spoke of a conspiracy, a fabrication, a wild tale concocted by a disgruntled boy and his accomplices. He tried to discredit Ethan's testimony, to portray him as a liar, a dreamer, a boy who had fabricated a story for revenge. His words, however, rang hollow, a desperate attempt to save a man who had already sealed his own fate with his actions. The jury was sent to deliberate, and the courtroom fell into a tense, expectant silence. Ethan, sitting with Marshal Stone, felt a mix of profound exhaustion and gut-wrenching anticipation. He had done everything he could. He had told his story, he had faced his accuser, and he had stood for the truth. Now it was up to the system. He thought about the community, about Sarah, about Thomas. He thought about Black Lightning, the magnificent horse who had been his companion on this journey, the one who had taught him the true meaning of freedom. He had fought for them. He had faced his fears. He had done what was right. The hours stretched on, each minute an eternity. The tension in the courtroom was a physical weight, pressing down on every person present. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jury returned, their faces grim, their movements slow and deliberate. The foreman, a man with a tired but resolute face, stood up and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sheriff Thorne, guilty on all counts." A wave of profound, overwhelming peace washed over Ethan, a sense of relief so immense it almost brought him to his knees. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, whispers, and a few quiet tears of joy. Thorne, for his part, was a statue carved from stone. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just sat there, a defeated man in a world he had once ruled. The judge sentenced him to a long prison term, a sentence that would ensure he would never again threaten the people of the West. As he was led away in chains, Thorne looked at Ethan, a flicker of raw, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. He saw not a boy but the cause of his downfall, the one who had taken everything from him. Ethan held his gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet dignity. He had no hatred for the man. He had defeated him, not with a weapon, but with the truth. He was a man who had found his purpose, a man who had found his strength, and a man who had found his freedom. He was no longer a victim. He was a victor. The news of the verdict reached the settlement a few days later, carried by a rider who had been waiting for the news at the closest telegraph office. The community erupted in a joyous celebration that was both spontaneous and deeply heartfelt. A massive bonfire was built, food was shared from every wagon and home, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and a profound sense of relief. It was a celebration of not only Thorne's defeat, but of their own survival, their own courage, and their own triumph. They had faced down a tyrant, and they had won. Ethan's return was a hero's welcome, a moment that would be etched into the town's memory forever. The community rushed out to meet him as he rode in, their faces a mix of pride, admiration, and unadulterated joy. He rode Black Lightning, the magnificent Mustang, now a symbol of their shared victory. The two of them, the boy and the horse, were a living legend, a testament to the power of a bond that was forged in the crucible of hardship. Sarah hugged him tightly, a silent promise of a future they would now build together. Her hug was not just a welcome, but an expression of her relief, her love, and her admiration for the man who had faced down a monster for her and her community. Thomas clapped him on the back, his eyes filled with a fatherly pride that words could not express. The children looked at him with awe, their faces full of wonder, as if they were looking at a character from a storybook. He was a living legend in their midst, a man who had proved that a person's character was worth more than a man's power. He had returned a hero, a man who had risked everything to save them, to fight for justice, and to expose a corrupt official. He had done more than just win a race. He had won the respect of a community, the love of a woman, and the freedom of a people. He had found his place in the world, and he had done it not by taking but by giving. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled, Ethan sat with Sarah and the rest of the community. He told them about the trial, about his journey, and about the new sheriff, Marshal Stone. He spoke of the justice that had been served, of the truth that had been revealed, and of the new chapter that was beginning for all of them. His voice was calm and steady, filled with a quiet power that came from a deep personal knowledge of the events. The community listened, their faces rapt, their hearts filled with a sense of peace that they had not known in years. He looked at the faces around the fire, at the faces of the people who had given him a home, a purpose, and a family. He thought about the day he had set out on his journey, a boy with nothing but a dream. He had found more than just a home. He had found a destiny. He had found a future. But he also knew that the past, no matter how distant, was always there. He had defeated Thorne, but the wounds he had inflicted on him, the lessons he had learned, they would always be a part of him. He was a man who had known hardship, and he would never forget it. He was a man who had known fear, and he would never forget it. But he was also a man who had known love, a man who had known courage, and a man who had found his place in the world. He was a living testament to the power of the human spirit, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, hope could be found, courage could be found, and a new life could be built. He looked at Black Lightning, who was resting peacefully in his enclosure, a symbol of his journey, of his strength and of his freedom. The horse had been his companion on this journey, a constant presence, a silent friend. He had taught him the true meaning of trust, of courage, and of freedom. The bond between them was a powerful, unspoken thing, a testament to a trust that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. The horse had trusted him, and in return, he had trusted the horse. And in the end, it was that trust that had saved them both. Ethan, a man who had once been nothing, was now a man who was everything. He was a hero, a deputy, a friend, and a son. He was a man who had a home, a purpose, and a future. He was a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness, a single act of courage, and a single act of hope. His story was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next. With Thorne's final defeat and the promise of a more just law under Marshal Stone, the community began to thrive in ways they had only dreamed of. The small encampment of tents and wagons began to transform into a real town, with permanent structures taking the place of temporary shelters. People from other settlements, hearing the story of their courage and the honesty of the new marshal, began to trickle in, looking to build a new life in a place where justice and fairness were held as core values. A schoolhouse was erected, its walls a testament to their belief in the future. A general store opened, its shelves stocked with goods that were once a luxury. The town was alive with the sound of hammers and saws, the constant symphony of progress, a testament to their hard work and their shared vision. Ethan, now Marshal Stone's trusted deputy, was instrumental in this growth. His story was an inspiration, and his presence was a reassurance. He helped people settle, he mediated disputes, and he was a constant calming presence in a world that was still filled with uncertainty. He was no longer just a boy. He was a leader, a man who had earned the respect of a community, a man who had proved that a person's character was worth more than a man's power. His leadership style was one of quiet authority, his voice a calm and steady presence that could diffuse a situation with a few well-chosen words. He was a man who led by example, not by force. He and Sarah's relationship blossomed into a deep and abiding love, a quiet, powerful bond that was a source of comfort and strength for them both. They were partners in every sense of the word, a quiet, powerful team. They would spend their days working, building, and planning for the future, and in the evenings they would sit together under the vast, star-filled sky, their shoulders touching, and dream about the life they would build together. "We did it, Ethan," Sarah said one evening, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "We built a home. We built a town. We built a life." Her voice was a mix of wonder and disbelief, as if she was still trying to grasp the reality of what they had accomplished. "We did," Ethan said, his voice a low, warm sound. "But it wasn't just us. It was everyone. Everyone who believed in us. Everyone who believed in something better. We were just a part of it, a small part of something big." He looked at her, and he saw his future. He saw a life filled with purpose, with love, and with a quiet, abiding peace. He had found his place in the world, and he would never again have to feel like an orphan, a boy alone in a harsh and unforgiving world. He was a man who had a home, a purpose, and a future. He was a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness, a single act of courage, and a single act of hope. The legacy of Black Lightning lived on. The Mustang, now a permanent resident of the community, was a symbol of their triumph. He would often be seen galloping across the plains, his black coat a streak of lightning against the blue sky, his power and his spirit a reminder of the freedom they had all fought for. The children of the town would often gather at the edge of the pasture, their faces pressed against the fence, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched the magnificent horse. They would whisper his name, a name that was now a part of their own history, a name that was a living testament to the power of a single act of courage. The story of the orphan boy who had tamed a Mustang, who had defeated a tyrant, and who had found a home, was a story that was passed down from generation to generation. It was a story that reminded people that even in the darkest of times, hope could be found, courage could be found, and a new life could be built. It was a story that was a living testament to the power of the human spirit, a testament to the fact that a man's worth was not measured by his power, but by his honor. Ethan, a man who had once been nothing, was now a man who had everything. He had a community that respected him, a woman who loved him, a horse that was his friend, and a future that was bright with promise. He was a man of the New West, a man who had built his own destiny. The town was no longer a temporary encampment, but a vibrant, thriving settlement. What had started as a circle of dusty wagons was now a collection of permanent structures, their lumber-hewn walls and tin roofs a testament to the hard work and shared vision of its inhabitants. A schoolhouse, still smelling of fresh pine and sawdust, stood proudly at the town's center, its future full of the promise of educated minds. Her general store, stocked with a growing array of goods, had become the beating heart of commerce and community gossip. More families, hearing whispered tales of the town's integrity and courage, had packed their wagons and moved in, drawn by the promise of a life built on fairness and hope. Ethan and Sarah, their quiet strength and unwavering kindness a beacon for others, were at the very core of this growth, their every action a silent promise of a better tomorrow. They were the town's moral compass, a living testament to what could be achieved when good people stood together. But just as the town began to find its rhythm, a final shadow from the past, a venomous ghost of a memory, returned. A letter, official and sealed with the state's crest, arrived for Marshal Stone, its arrival a chilling premonition. The contents were grim, their words a cold hammer blow to the newfound peace. Thorne had escaped from prison. He had been a model prisoner, quiet and cooperative, but it had all been a ruse, a calculated performance to deceive his captors. His obedience was a mask, his silence a sign of a plan brewing beneath the surface. He had escaped, and his motive was clear, his rage a fiery brand in his soul. He was coming back for one thing and one thing only: revenge. He wanted to finish the job he had started, to destroy the boy who had humiliated him and the community that had dared to stand against him. A wave of fear and uncertainty washed over the town, its peaceful demeanor shattering like glass. Thorne was not a man to be trifled with, and his escape was a chilling reminder of his power and his cruelty. The town, now a beacon of hope, was once again in danger, its future hanging by a thread. The people who had been laughing and building just moments before now stood in quiet fear, their eyes filled with a shared sense of dread. The silence was thick with the unspoken question: what would a man like Thorne, with nothing left to lose, do to a town that had taken everything from him? Marshal Stone and Ethan, now a true team, worked tirelessly to prepare the town for Thorne's inevitable return. They were a study in contrasts. Stone, the seasoned lawman, his face grim and resolute. Ethan, the young deputy, his heart a mix of quiet resolve and a deep, simmering anger. They organized patrols, their watchful eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a threat. They reinforced the town's defenses, barricading doors and fortifying windows, turning a peaceful settlement into a fortress. Ethan, for his part, was consumed by a quiet rage. He had thought this chapter of his life was over. He had thought he was free from the shadow of the man who had tormented him. He had been wrong. The peace he had found, the home he had built, now felt fragile, a house of cards waiting to be toppled by the vengeful hand of a man who saw nothing but destruction. He went to Black Lightning's enclosure, the horse a silent, knowing presence. He ran his hand over the horse's neck, the muscles taut with a familiar energy, a silent promise of a fight yet to come. "He's coming back, boy," Ethan whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "He's coming back to finish what he started, to burn this town down, to make us pay for what we did." The horse whinnied, a sound of both warning and defiance. He was ready. He was ready to fight for his home, for his freedom, and for the man who had tamed him not with force, but with love. The bond between them was a powerful, unspoken thing, a testament to a trust that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. The showdown was not long in coming. Thorne, a man with nothing left to lose, rode into town, a few hired guns at his back. He was a man consumed by rage, a man who would burn the world down just to see it burn. He was no longer a man of the law. He was a man of chaos, a walking, breathing monument to a hatred that knew no bounds. He was a ghost of the past, come back to haunt the future. "Where is he?" Thorne bellowed, his voice a low, guttural roar that echoed through the silent streets. "Where is the boy who humiliated me? Send him out, and maybe I'll let you live. You fools!" Ethan stepped out from behind a wagon, his hand on his revolver, his gaze fixed on Thorne's face. "I'm here, Thorne," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. I'm a man now, and this is my home. You won't take it from me." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound that scraped against the quiet dignity of the town. "You're a fool, boy. You're a hero in a town full of fools. But you're no match for me. You're just a boy. You were lucky once. You won't be lucky again." "I may be just a boy," Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet power. "But I have something you'll never have. I have a community. I have a purpose. And I have a horse who will fight for me, not because I forced him to, but because he chooses to." With a final chilling sneer, Thorne drew his gun, his eyes filled with a murderous intent. But before he could even aim, Marshal Stone, who had been hiding in the shadows, stepped out, his own gun drawn. "It's over, Thorne," Stone said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "You're finished. You lost the day you decided to poison a community's water, and you lost when you escaped. This is the end of the line for you." Thorne, in a final act of desperation, turned and fired at Stone, but he was too slow. A shot rang out, a sharp, clean sound that echoed through the quiet streets, and Thorne, a man who had once ruled with an iron fist, fell to the ground, his body a lifeless heap in the dust. The town once again was safe. The shadow of the past had finally been defeated, and a new chapter could begin, a chapter of peace, of hope, and of a future that was no longer haunted by a man who had a heart full of darkness. The town buried Thorne in a shallow grave on the outskirts of the settlement, a final, fitting end for a man who had no respect for life. The community, now truly free from the shadow of his tyranny, celebrated with a quiet, profound sense of peace. The future, once so uncertain, was now a bright open road, stretching out before them like a promise. The air was filled with a palpable sense of relief, a collective exhale from a town that had held its breath for far too long. The fear, the dread, the constant sense of unease. It was all gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. Ethan, a man who had faced death and had triumphed, felt a new sense of purpose. He had been a deputy, a witness, a hero, but now he was something more. He was a man who had found his place in the world. He was a man who had a home, a community, and a family. The scars of his past, the taunts, the loneliness, the hardships, they were no longer a source of pain, but a source of strength. They had shaped him, molded him into the man he was today. A man who was respected, admired, and loved. He and Sarah, their love now a deep and abiding promise, decided to get married. The wedding was a simple affair, a ceremony under the open sky with the community as their witnesses. It was a beautiful, heartfelt celebration of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. Thomas, with a fatherly pride, walked Sarah down the makeshift aisle, his eyes filled with tears of joy. He had watched her grow from a quiet, hopeful girl into a strong, resilient woman. Ethan, standing at the end of the aisle, felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. He was no longer an orphan. He was a husband, he was a son. He was a part of something bigger than himself, a part of a family, a part of a community, a part of a new beginning. After the wedding, they settled into a life of quiet, peaceful purpose. Ethan continued to work as Marshal Stone's deputy, a man who was respected and admired by all. He was a man who was not only a lawman, but a community leader, a man who had a deep understanding of the people he served. Sarah continued to work on the land, a woman who had a gentle heart and a strong spirit. She was the town's healer, its moral compass, its guiding light. They were partners in every sense of the word, a quiet, powerful team, their love and their work, a testament to their unwavering belief in a better future. They built a small home together, a simple but sturdy cabin that was filled with love and laughter. It was a home that was a testament to their courage, their perseverance, and their unwavering belief in a better future. It was a home that was a stark contrast to the lonely, oppressive life Ethan had once known. It was a place where he could be himself, where he could be safe, where he could be loved. It was a home that was built not on greed or power, but on trust, on compassion, and on love. The town, now a testament to their courage, continued to thrive. A school was built, a church was erected, and a steady stream of people continued to arrive, drawn by the promise of a new life, a life built on fairness, on justice, and on community. The story of the orphan boy and the wild Mustang became a legend, a story that was passed down from generation to generation, a story that was told around campfires and in quiet homes. It was a story of a boy who had nothing but a dream, a man who had fought for justice, and a community that had found its courage. It was a story that was a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness, a single act of courage, and a single act of hope. It was a story that would live on forever, a timeless tale of a boy who had found his place in the world. Years passed, and the small settlement that had once been a temporary camp was now a bustling, thriving town. It was a town of honest men and women, of families who had found a new life, a new home, and a new hope. The town, now a beacon of justice and fairness, was a living testament to the courage of a boy who had once been an orphan. The dusty streets were now lined with buildings, the sound of hammers and saws a constant symphony of progress. Children ran and played in the streets, their laughter a joyful sound that filled the air. The town was alive, vibrant, and full of a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. Ethan, now a man in his prime, was a respected leader, a man who was admired and loved by all. He was still Marshal Stone's deputy, a man who was known for his quiet strength and his unwavering sense of justice. He was a man who had found his purpose, a man who had found his place in the world. His hands, once calloused from a life of hard labor, were now a testament to a life of service. His eyes, once filled with a quiet desperation, were now filled with a deep, abiding peace. He was a living legend, a man who had inspired a community, a man who had changed the course of a town's history. He and Sarah had a small family, a boy and a girl, who were raised with the same values that had been instilled in them, of kindness, of courage, and of a deep and abiding respect for others. They were taught to see the world not as a place of fear and greed, but as a place of opportunity and hope. They were taught to see the good in people, to stand up for what was right and to never give up on their dreams. They were a testament to the love and the legacy of their parents, a living promise of a future that would be built on a foundation of honor and integrity. Black Lightning, now an old but still magnificent horse, was a part of the family. He would spend his days in the pasture, a quiet, knowing presence, and his nights in the barn, a warm and comforting presence. He was a living legend, a symbol of the freedom they had all fought for, and a reminder of the journey they had all taken. The children would often go to the barn, their eyes wide with wonder, and listen to the stories their father would tell them about the horse who had taught him what it means to be free. Ethan would often sit with his children, their faces a mix of awe and wonder, and tell them the story of the race, of the trial, and of the man who had tried to destroy their home. He would tell them of the courage of a community, the strength of a woman, and the loyalty of a wild horse. He would tell them that a man's worth was not measured by his power, but by his honor. He would tell them that they were a part of something bigger than themselves, that they were a part of a legacy of hope, of courage, and of a new beginning. They were a part of a story that would live on, forever. And as he would speak, he would look at his children, at his wife, at the town that had given him a home, and at the horse that had taught him what it means to be free. And in that moment, he would feel a sense of profound, overwhelming peace. He was no longer the orphan boy who had been mocked by a sheriff. He was a man who had tamed a Mustang, a man who had found his place in the world, and a man who had built a future for his family and for a community that had given him a home. The journey had ended, but the legacy of hope, of courage, and of love would live on forever, a timeless testament to a boy who had dared to dream. The sun, a fiery orange ball in the sky, began its slow descent, painting the dusty plains with a warm, golden light. A cool breeze, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, swept across the land, a gentle whisper of the coming night. It was a peaceful evening, one of the many that had filled Ethan's life since he had found his home. The town, his town, was a quiet, comforting presence, its lights twinkling in the gathering dusk, a beacon of hope in a world that was still wild and untamed. Ethan, a man now with a touch of grey in his hair and a few more lines on his face, sat on the porch of his home, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was no longer a deputy, having passed the torch to a younger, more energetic man. He was now a respected elder, a man who was sought out for his wisdom and his quiet counsel. He was a man who had seen it all, a man who had faced the worst of humanity and had still found the best. His children, now grown, had families of their own, and his grandchildren would often sit at his feet, their eyes wide with wonder, listening to the stories he would tell. Stories of a boy and a wild horse, of a race against a tyrant, and of a community that had found its courage. Stories that were no longer just tales, but a part of their own history, a part of their own identity. Sarah, her hair now a beautiful shade of silver, sat beside him, their hands intertwined. They had a lifetime of shared memories, of hardships overcome, of love that had grown stronger with each passing year. They were two people who had found each other in a harsh and unforgiving world, and they had built a life together that was a testament to their strength and their love. They were a living, breathing promise that even in the darkest of times, hope could be found, love could be found, and a new life could be built. Black Lightning, now an old but still majestic horse, was a constant, comforting presence. He would spend his days in the pasture, a quiet, knowing presence, and his nights in the barn, a warm and comforting presence. He was a living legend, a symbol of the freedom they had all fought for, and a reminder of the journey they had all taken. The horse who had once been a wild and untamable spirit was now a gentle and loving companion, a silent testament to the power of a bond that was built on trust, not on force. Ethan looked at his town, at the homes that were filled with love and laughter, at the faces of the people who had given him a home, and at the horse that had taught him what it means to be free. He thought about the day he had set out on his journey, a boy with nothing but a dream. He had found more than just a home. He had found a destiny. He was no longer the orphan boy who had been mocked by a sheriff. He was a man who had tamed a Mustang, a man who had found his place in the world, and a man who had built a future for his family and for a community that had given him a home. He was a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness, a single act of courage, and a single act of hope. His story was a story that would live on forever, a timeless testament to a boy who had dared to dream, a man who had fought for justice, and a town that had found its soul. The sun finally set, and the stars, one by one, began to twinkle in the vast, dark sky. The air grew cool, and a sense of peace, a sense of profound, overwhelming peace, settled over the land. Ethan, a man who had once been nothing, was now a man who was everything. He was a hero, a husband, a father, and a friend. He was a man who had found his place in the world, and he was home. The journey had ended, but the legacy of hope, of courage, and of love would live on forever in the hearts of the people he had helped, the family he had built, and the town he had saved.